All right, looks like we've already got a bunch of people rolling in so far. Already eclipsed 100 and it's counting quickly, so it's good to see. I think we're gonna have a good turnout tonight. We'll just give some of the latecomers a minute here just to start rolling in before we begin, but I'm actually surprised to see how many people are showing up when I think some deer have been getting shot this past week with this cold front we're just coming off of, and another one is starting in parts of the country.
Yep, getting busy quick.
All right, well, it's starting to settle down a little bit, so I think we're going to start rolling, everybody. Welcome to tonight's hunt class. We've had several of these now over the past year and a half at HuntStand. They continue to be successful, have a great attendance, great engagement, and we're just really thankful that everybody joins us for these because put a lot of work into them, and hopefully that translates on your side. We really like to provide you with the information that you need to be a better hunter, and especially a better whitetail hunter. And that is our core focus tonight, the main event of whitetail hunting. If whitetail hunting was football, the rut would be the Super Bowl. If it was baseball, it'd be the World Series. And I'm not even a sports guy, but I can tell you that the rut is the main event of whitetail hunting. So that's what we're going to talk about this evening. First, I'll introduce myself. My name is Josh Dahlke. I'm the content director at HuntStand. Wear a lot of different hats here, from content to supporting testing and development of the app, etc. I've been in outdoor media for a long time, and I'm really happy to be with HuntStand. It's been a great run so far, and we're looking forward to a bright future. And speaking of that future, HuntStand, if you've been to one of these hunt classes before, you know I've said it before, it is the #1 hunting and land management app. We have an incredible community of users from north to south, east to west, all across North America. And as the topic tonight is aptly presented, whitetail hunting is the main deal for HuntStand. Most of our feature set is heavily built around the whitetail hunter. It's where our roots come from. It's what we spend the most energy on and focus for the development of the app and the community and the information we provide. So really excited to dig into some rut talk this evening. Now, HuntStand is undergoing a brand new update right now. So several of you who are in this hunt class might already have it, and then some of you might not. That's because it's a slow rollout as we're continuing to soften the edges on some things and make sure everything is dialed and make changes as we need to support this major overhaul that we just undergone. And since you're here at this hunt class, I'll give you kind of an insider perspective on this new update. First of all, it was long overdue for HuntStand to have a facelift. Better user experience, better user interface. That was what we were shooting for. Make it easier for one-handed operation. Just make it easier overall for application in the field and for e-scouting and getting everything to work together properly. And what a lot of you may not understand is also our back-end infrastructure that we improved with this update is pivotal for us to be able to move forward into the future and bring you the features that you're going to appreciate and the features that you deserve as our loyal community at HuntStand. So this isn't just a pretty facelift on the front end, it's also significant on the back end to support our growth and support your growth as a HuntStand user. So if you haven't gotten the update already, you will be in the near future. We'll be putting out some communications within the app through emails, social media, etc. We're going to have tutorial videos and strategy videos and a bunch of supporting content to help you as you adapt in the new app. And I can tell you that we've been testing it for a long time, and there are still some kinks to work out, but our team has already been on several hunts this year with it, and we've been having a great time with it. It's really an awesome improvement once you get used to it, and I think you're really going to appreciate that. So If you do run into any issues, which will happen with a new technology like this, the best thing you can do is go into the contact us part of the app. Within the app, in the upper left menu, and that'll allow you to submit a support ticket that goes directly to our development team. We get all of them, we see all of them, we file them according to priority, and they're working on it 24/7. So if you have feedback, if you have an issue, please go to that contact us section in the app, and that will put the information exactly where it needs to go to our development team. So I'll leave it at that for the new update, but I hope those of you who have been using it so far are digging it. And I know that our whole team is really enjoying the experience. So as part of that, HuntStand Pro Whitetail, also applicable to the topic tonight, and also applicable to our very special guest who I will introduce here shortly, Brian Murphy. He was the brains behind HuntStand Pro Whitetail and the core features that we have in HuntStand Pro Whitetail, which namely would be the whitetail activity forecast, which is the single most accurate, scientifically proven, biologically proven algorithm that you are going to find in any whitetail predictive tool, hands down. There's no refuting that. And that's because of the hard work that Brian put in, and the long hours and weeks and months and I could say maybe even years that he put into building this out, working with state agencies and biologists to get real data that supports what drives whitetail movement. So that's what you're going to find in our whitetail activity forecast in HuntStand Pro Whitetail. Please check it out if you haven't already. Bunch more information on that at huntstand.com, including the other features in HuntStand Pro Whitetail, the first ever nationwide whitetail rut map, broken down to the most granular level you're going to find anywhere, even down to deer herd level, not just region or zip code, but down to deer herds at points, based on the information that Brian was able to dig up through all the state agencies and research that was at his fingertips. And then a couple other features in there worth noting would be the whitetail habitat suitability map, just a really nice macro view that you can take when you're e-scouting to figure out where whitetails are most likely to be, especially if you're doing any traveling trips out of state, areas that you're unfamiliar with. That whitetail habitat map is a really nice starting point to start to drill down on your e-scouting for a whitetail hunt. And then our monthly satellite imagery is also extremely popular. It gives you a monthly view. We update it every single month of satellite imagery for wherever you want to look in the country. It's recent, so it's not ultra high resolution, but it shows you some of those macro perspectives that are important, like clear cuts or burns, or if there's snow on the ground, or if there's flooding, that type of stuff. The monthly satellite is very powerful if you use it properly. I know that I've used it a lot just in my e-scouting, looking at different habitat types as they transition throughout the year and leaf cover drops, and you can really identify some of those dense pockets that are often bedding areas for whitetails. Just one more tool in the arsenal that HuntStand provides if you subscribe to HuntStand Pro Whitetail. So please check it out if you haven't already. You're doing yourself a disservice if you're a whitetail hunter and you don't have HuntStand Pro Whitetail. So I'm going to turn it over to our special guest and my friend. I'm proud to call my friend, Brian Murphy. He's been with HuntStand for many, many years now, and his resume extends far beyond that. He is one of the foremost deer experts in the country, in North America, and he runs in the circle, the very tight circle of the foremost whitetail experts in existence. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Brian for further introduction, and then we'll kick it off into this rut hunt class.
Thanks, Josh. And thank all of you for joining us tonight. I mean, if you're a whitetail hunter and you can't get excited about the rut and learning about whitetails, then you're in the wrong place, because I've been doing this a long time and I still get geeked out about this stuff. I've been fortunate enough to do nothing but whitetail work or deer work in general for about 40 years. And I'm still just as eat up with it as you'll find anybody out there. And I still try to learn something every time I interact with, whether it be an experienced hunter or a whitetail expert who's got decades of research experience. I look at all sources of information. I don't try to limit it to just the academics or just the field hunters and try to blend all of that together And that's been really the basis of my career, is to take the science of deer, the quality vetted science, and translate that into layman terms so that hunters can use it. Because without translation down to that user level, science for the sake of science doesn't do anybody any good. Because I'm first and foremost a hunter. I grew up hunting and trapping, and I'm an outdoors person at heart. And I was just fortunate enough to follow a career path doing something I've enjoyed and has taken me all over the whitetails range. I've been fortunate to walk properties in just about every state in the U.S. that has whitetails in them, and work with landowners and hunters there, and sit in hunt camps, understand the culture, the cultural differences, the regional differences in the biology of the animal. So it's really been just a true blessing for me. So thanks you for coming. I sure hope you learned something. I think I've got a special treat for you. Some of you joined us perhaps last year. We did a similar thing last year, and I've got some of that background information again to share with you, but I've got some brand new research to share towards the end of the presentation that has never seen the light of the public. It was just completed by Mississippi State University, that looked very specifically at adult buck bedding areas during the breeding season, where they're bedding in relation to different habitat features, and also how they use food plots during the hunting season. And these are mature bucks, and a lot of them radio collared. So we're going to really end with some cool stuff. I know it's going to open your eyes. So let's dive right in if we can. Just talk a little bit about. Go ahead.
Actually, right, just before we cut into it, I just want to say to everybody, we do have a live Q&A and live chat running right now. And we also received all the questions that you all submitted during the registration process, which we will do a Q&A session at the end. We will be answering some questions live as well in the chat as we're able to. And then even throughout, I'll kick some questions over to Brian to break things up here. But just know that we are seeing your comments. We did get your questions that you submitted before. And it behooves you to stay until the end. We like to dangle the carrot. We are going to give away 3 really sweet prize packages for those of you who stick around to the bitter end. But I can promise you that prizes or not, you're going to want to stick around, because if you geek out on whitetails, I can listen to Brian talk infinitely, and I've known him for a long time, but every time I hear him talk, he teaches me something new. And especially with some of that new research that he's going to reveal, it's going to be a really cool night. So we'll kick into it, Brian.
All right, let's jump right in. Let's just kind of start at the very basic level. What is the rut? All right. I think most people understand that it's a time that we all look forward to when bucks are chasing does, but it's really a broader period of the whitetails year than many people understand. And there's different segments and different important biological things going on within deer herds that really bring the bucks and does together to synchronize that breeding. And so the rut itself is just that annual period of increased sexual activity and breeding in deer. Obviously, all deer species go through some form of this rut. Most of them look pretty similar, but there are some differences as well. Now, in most cases, hunters particularly observe the behavioral differences in bucks more than we do in does. Not that does don't have certain behavioral changes as well, but what we see among bucks, we see rubbing and scraping and sparring and fighting and chasing and vocalizations. We see a number of different things that peak during some period of that annual rut cycle. So let's jump on into kind of starting to break it down a little bit further if we can. First thing is how do biologists, how do we determine when the rut is? Because how many of you have heard, and you don't have to answer this now because you can answer it in your head pretty quick. How many of you talked to the local hunters? Has the rut started in my area yet? When did it start? Was it early? Was it late? Was it driven by the moon, etc.? And you probably wonder why or how biologists even determine this. Well, it's actually quite easy science in the big scheme of things. Most state agencies, particularly those in the southern United States that have highly variable ruts, and we'll talk about the differences in rut timing north versus south in the whitetails range, but we use a standard process called fetal measurements. And a good friend of mine, one of my mentors, Joe Hamilton, created a little ruler many years ago. You see it on the slide there, that you can place a fetus taken from a harvested doe, put it on there and measure a crown of the head to the rump length of that fetus. And it tells you how that fetus is in days. You simply subtract that number of days from the day that the doe was harvested, and you have the days she bred. It's really simple. And if you take enough samples from a given property or area, you can plot the rut. So it's really simple science. A lot of hunters actually do this. Those that are collecting reproductive data on their deer herds can do this themselves and don't need biologists or any fancy equipment. It's really simple stuff. If we don't have that, sometimes we have to dig a little deeper. And this is where most hunters wouldn't have access to this information. But one is the fawn drop dates. We call it parturition dates. So there have been a number of whitetail studies that have looked at when fawns hit the ground. And if you collect enough fawns and can determine their age at time of drop, which there's actually a device that you can put inside a doe's reproductive tract that will be expelled when the fawn hits the ground, sends off a signal. Researchers go in and find those fawns and know that they were born within, minutes to hours of that device signal going off. So that's another good way. In absence of one of those two, what we'd consider more gold standard techniques, some states have had to rely, in areas at least, on car collision data. And you think, how in the world can that be a measure of the rut? Well, I think we all know that bucks and does get more active during the breeding season. And the peak of deer car collisions, a number of studies have correlated the connection between peak car collisions and the rut. It's not as fine a measurement as some of these others, but it can get you pretty close. The same is true in states that allow hunting during the breeding season, that the peak of adult buck harvest typically peaks right around the 2 weeks of peak conception during the peak of the rut. So some really good ways to get there and some sort of backdoor ways to get there. The one thing that I can say with certainty, and it has been repeated in studies all over the whitetails range, from Canada to South Texas to South Florida and every place in between, is that the moon does not impact the time of breeding on a whitetail. Old wives' tales still exist, but it's easy to disprove this because, again, we can take a lot of fetal measurements in a given area and do it year after year, and then look at what phase the moon was that year. And there just simply isn't a relationship. And it does make sense. The moon, the cycle of full moon or whatever changes year to year. And so if a whitetail was chasing the moon, it would be dropping fawns at different times. Every year would be a different cycle. So it doesn't really make sense from a species survival standpoint. But one thing is also unknown by many hunters is the fact that once you have a rut for your area, you've pretty much got that rut for your area. It's going to vary very little year to year. You're not going to see huge swings in peak breeding from year to year. Again, if you look at fetal measurements. So anyhow, one thing, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So what causes the rut? And this is where there's a lot of intriguing stuff for a whitetail biologist like myself. We do know that in the big sort of driving factor across the whitetails range is photoperiod. That's just length of daylight hours. And as that begins to shorten as we enter autumn this time of year, obviously it sends a signal, actually sends it through the deer's optic nerve in its eye. It doesn't know this is occurring, but the changing daylight triggers a response in the eye that triggers a response in the brain that releases a hormone called melatonin. Melatonin sends a chain reaction down to the deer's genitals, and all of a sudden, the deer starts getting in the mood. And that's kind of what triggers this. However, in the southern United States, we see some other things that can also impact it. We see localized environmental conditions, spring floods, certain dry times of the year in certain areas, perhaps even genetics and stalking source. Many hunters know we restocked whitetails throughout a lot of their range, so some of that holdovers is still carrying today. But as you move north, though, in the whitetails range, we'll talk a little bit about this more later, the rut gets more and more consistent because it has to. If a deer herd doesn't breed in November, which most of the northern half of the United States does, if you don't have a November rut, those fawns simply don't survive. So they can't perpetuate those sort of more protracted or variable breeding seasons. And conversely, as you move towards the equator with any deer species, whitetails included, we have whitetails that go all the way through Mexico into northern South America. So the whitetails range is well beyond the United States, not just in Canada, but well through, again, South and Central America. And towards the equator, those whitetails can breed year round. You can have bucks in hard antler, bucks, does pregnant, not pregnant, cycling, not cycling. You can have kind of a mismatch of breeding timing there because there's no penalty. Near the equator, times are good year round, so there's no penalty for that. So in the southern United States, we have 210 days of variation in rut timing, which is 7 months. So think about that. There's a rut 7 months of the year in the South, 1 month or the other. However, in the northern half of the United States, we only see 45 days total variation. So again, very consistent. If you draw a line more or less from, we'll say, Oklahoma to North Carolina, that's kind of that dividing line more or less in the center part of the country.
So Brian, I think this is a good time just to mention how this relates to how you what you went through to work on the first ever nationwide rut map that we have in HuntStand Pro Whitetail. Can you break it down for people, kind of the insider view on how you
Yeah,
got the data?
as a deer biologist, I was aware that there was a lot of variation in rut timing. Many hunters are aware of that. If you've hunted in Mississippi or Louisiana or Florida, you know that you may be experiencing a rut in January or one also in July in some parts of southern Florida. So highly variable. So when I set out to develop the nationwide rut map, obviously I contacted all the state agencies to get as much available data as I could. Most of them could provide that pretty readily. Others had bits and pieces. In some cases, I had to actually analyze their data for them. But there were 4,240 U.S. counties or parishes that had whitetails in them. And however, many of those counties, particularly in the Deep South, had more than one rut in a county. So I actually ended up with over 5,500 unique data sets for the rut map. So if you're a pro whitetail subscriber and you look at your area, in some counties, particularly in the Louisiana, Mississippi region, you'll see more than one rut listed for a county. The county is obviously lines drawn to show you where those different areas are. So quite a lot of work, but that's also a good lead in to the deer predictive tool that I created. And that's one reason that we'll put ours up against anybody's out there, because one of the biggest drivers of deer movement is where that deer herd is in relation to its breeding cycle. And again, some breeding cycles are in July in South Florida, some are in November, some are in all those 7 months I mentioned. So until you had the rut map underlay and where that particular deer herd is, there's no way anybody could come up with a deer movement predictor, because during the breeding season, those things trump everything else we know of in terms of what drives deer movements. So good point, Josh. All right, let's go on to the next slide. So let's go through the sort of rut phases, and we'll talk about the pre-rut. And the pre-rut's actually a long period of time. A lot of people kind of think the pre-rut is that seeking phase, and it certainly includes that. But the pre-rut is actually from about the time a deer sheds its velvet on its antlers up until the rut begins. So it's a pretty long period, but there's a lot of changes going on during that period. We see initially rubbing on trees, velvet removal, signposting behavior, followed by some scraping. Then we enter the sort of sparring phase. I've already started getting a lot of that on trail cam here locally. So we're kind of in that sparring, sort of getting ready for the prelude to the rut right now, at least in my area of the Deep South. What's interesting is bucks are fertile. As soon as they shed the velvet on their antlers, they're ready to breed, and they can. However, we don't see does cycling at that time of the year, very few, early birds, if you will. So the bucks prepare ahead of the game. They're building neck muscles and the testosterone levels that peak in them during this pre-rut period. They have specialized cells in their neck and other parts of the body that allow them to beef up very quickly under the influence of that steroid hormone. You wonder why bucks' necks get big and they get mean, because they're getting juiced with testosterone, which is a steroid hormone. So just like a bodybuilder taking steroids, the same thing deer's doing. They're getting bigger, stronger, and meaner, but also more interested in breeding. So during this pre-rut period, it's all about advertising. It's about strengthening their muscles, getting ready, but it's about leaving as much signpost behavior in the environment so that does can find them and they can find does when that rut begins. So that's really the goal of the pre-rut period for a buck, is to do everything he can to get ready, put on fat, to mark his environment, scrapes and rubs, and interact with a lot of social groups of deer, and just be ready when that first doe cycles. And that's the end of the pre-rut, is that seeking phase when they're looking for that first, estrus doe of the year. So that then transitions into the rut.
So Brian, before we head into the rut per se, our guy Ron here in the live Q&A asked an interesting question, which might be a little bit difficult to answer, but why does some mock scrapes work and others don't?
Yeah, I don't know if I can answer that question. It probably has something to do with the buck age structure in that particular environment, because my experience is if you've got a lot of adult bucks, they will hit mock scrapes and hit obviously natural scrapes as well. So it may be just the sheer lack of buck age structure or buck abundance. But we find that, and I've got a slide a little later on that talks about the percentage number and percentage of rubs and scrapes that young versus mature bucks make. And young bucks and old bucks make similar numbers of rubs, but young bucks make significantly fewer scrapes than mature bucks. And so it could be a buck age structure related phenomenon. What's interesting with the mock scrape research that's been done on that subject is that in many cases, it doesn't seem to matter even what you put in the mock scrape. In fact, one graduate project tried graduate student urine, and it attracted about as many bucks as any of the off-the-shelf products that were tested, and even bare soil tested quite well. Just the presence of the bare soil and a licking branch, of course, the proper scrape setup performed well. So that's the best I can answer that question right now. Peak rut, and I think it's important to define what I'm talking about here. When I say peak rut, what I'm referring to is the period when most breeding occurs. So that's the peak of the rut from a biologist's perspective. It may not be the peak of rut-related activity that hunters see. So make sure we understand the differences here. So when biologists talk about the peak of the rut, they're talking about that magic generally about a 2-week period in which most does will breed. That sometimes is not the best time to harvest a mature buck, because in many cases during this very active breeding period, bucks will gather a hot doe, move her into heavy cover to protect her from other rival bucks, and guard her 24 to 36 hours. And during that period, if she doesn't move much, he's not going to move much, and therefore you as a hunter may not see much activity. We call that the lockdown phase, which can be very real, particularly if you've got a very balanced adult buck to doe ratio, because then a buck is very likely to be locked down with a doe and not out trolling looking for more does. But during this peak rut, not only is breeding occurring, bucks are obviously in peak aggressive mode. It's not uncommon to have true fights. We see more sparring during the pre-rut phase. We see often some knockdown, drag-out fights during the peak of the rut. But of course, that could be used to your advantage. Tactics, rattling and calling. And I particularly like the grunt, snort, wheeze during that time of year. That's the most aggressive vocalization a buck can make. So incorporating a grunt, snort, wheeze in with a rattling or calling sequence during the peak of the rut can be quite helpful here. What's also interesting is that if you're a fan of hunting rubs and scrapes, particularly scrapes, those are going to typically go cold about 7 days before peak of breeding. So during the peak of the rut itself, the peak of the breeding part of the rut, rubs and scrapes in particular, will often go very cold on you because they don't have time to advertise. They're out looking. They don't have time to they may check some scrapes, but they're less likely to engage with scrapes during the peak of the rut than they are in the pre-rut or the post-rut phase. So I wouldn't focus on hunting scrapes in general, because most of the activity is at night, but certainly during the peak of the rut, I would get in heavy cover, the transition areas between an area that a doe might be taken to by a buck. So I would be hunting cover during the peak of the rut. All right, let's move on. The waning rut. So this is the transition period between the peak rut and what we'll talk about next, called the second rut. This is that in-between time. So you're coming out of the peak of the rut. The number of estrus does is dropping. Bucks, though, are still interested. Okay, peak of the rut may be over, but they're not done, and so they're still looking, and they're still trolling, and they're still out there on their feet. They're still almost in a rut-like mode, in the sense of not eating a lot, still using a large part of their home range in search of does, and so you start to see this sort of transition to, it starts to wane a little bit. That's why we call it the waning rut. It starts to slow down just as we enter the second rut, which we'll talk about next. But again, this is a time of bucks seeking a smaller number of receptive does. So calling can still be effective here, particularly, doe bleats and other things can be quite useful here. This is, again, just a handful of those does that didn't get bred on the first cycle. Now, a lot of hunters will talk about, not seeing a very pronounced rut where they are, trickle rut. And typically, and I'll talk about that in a minute, is due to an unbalanced sex ratio or young buck age structures. But if you've got a tuned up deer herd, you should see a very pronounced rut. It should be hot and heavy, but pretty quick. And that's a very good thing, because you want as many does to breed early and together as possible, because that then allows a very tight fawn drop 200 days later. And that's what Mother Nature intended. It didn't intend for deer and does to just keep cycling and breed over months of the year. That's not good for a deer herd. It also increases the number of fawns you're going to lose to predation, and a number of those young bucks that are born late will never catch up from an antler development perspective. So you want a very concise, active rut. It's also a heck of a lot of fun to hunt when they're fired up and just really working hard out there. All right, we'll go on to the second rut.
I'll actually mention, I thought of you today, Brian. We just released a new HuntStand original film. If you guys watch and haven't checked it out yet, maybe check it out after the class or tomorrow on our YouTube channel. But it's from an Oklahoma whitetail hunt we did last year. And I certainly improperly referred to what was going on at the time as post-rut activity. But what I meant to say was more of a waning rut activity that we were experiencing in Oklahoma. So I kind of cringed when I saw that, because I was like, oh man, Brian's going to see this and shoot me a text message and have to educate me. But before we move on to the next phase here, we do have a question that is related and also very interesting from Shane Purdue. He asks, do mature bucks roam as much during the rut as younger bucks, or do you think they stay in their core area and tend to doze closer?
That's a great question. In fact, one that I've got a slide on some of the common myths and misconceptions about the rut here in just a couple of slides. So it's a great leading question. The research has actually been pretty clear here that despite a hunter's belief that a mature buck's going to greatly expand his home range and travel the country looking for does and whipping all takers, the research doesn't support that. And we've got, radio transmitters on enough bucks now. What we see, though, is the mature bucks don't greatly expand their home range. However, they use a higher percentage of it during the rut. So if their home range is 600, 800 acres, whatever, during some parts of the year, say the pre-rut or the post-rut, they may only use a third of that acreage on a regular basis. However, during the rut, they expand that. They really take advantage of their entire home range. So to the hunter who's running trail cameras, their perception is that he's spreading out to new areas. It's just really him taking advantage of his whole home range more adequately. So good question, though. All right, second rut, and this is also a little bit misunderstood by a lot of hunters. It's simply the whitetail's estrus cycle is about 28 to 30 days in between those. So if they don't get bred on their first estrus cycle of the year, whenever that is for your area, they have to wait a full month. They can't breed again the next week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks later. They have to wait a month. That's how the body works. So they have to wait a full month. So if you know that when the peak of your normal peak rut is, you can add 30 days to that, and that will be when your second rut occurs. And that is a time that two things happen. One, any does that weren't successful breeding, any adult does that weren't successful breeding on their first estrus cycle back in the peak rut, will cycle again and have a chance to breed a second time. But it's also a time where you get some of these younger does, and I'm talking about 18-month-old yearling does, and then also 6-month-old fawn does. Many of those will cycle for the first time later in the season, often around that second rut time frame. So you get the leftover adult does, and in many cases, you get those first-time breeders, the fawns and or the 1.5s, which are cycling in many cases for the first time. Hopefully, you don't have a third rut, which is possible, but certainly most by the end of the second rut, in almost every deer herd out there, with very few exceptions, you're going to see over 90% of the does will have successfully bred by that period of time. It can be a good time to pick up a buck, but typically that second rut is only about 30% of the activity, pronounced activity of the primary rut. Post rut is everything after that, right? So after the rut ends, bucks are going to slowly start to lose their interest and really start to focus on regaining that lost body condition. It's not uncommon for a buck to lose 20, 25, even 30% of its pre-rut body weight. So they're in pretty bad shape. They don't eat a lot, they travel a lot, and they're worn out. So this is a period often, particularly in the northern U.S. and the Midwest, Northeast, you're going to see some very harsh winter conditions. So we can see some buck mortality during that period, just simple not enough nutrition to sustain them through those tough times. But it can also be a great time to harvest a mature buck, because they're almost forced to go find those food sources. They're so depleted that they're going to roll the dice and hit those food sources. So if you as a hunter can take those cold conditions late in the hunting season, I would definitely encourage you to get out there and give it a look, because they're probably going to be hitting those food sources, particularly late in the afternoon.
Well, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong. If I remember, back from your QDMA days when I attended one of your classes, I believe that was where I learned that you can actually, it's really the does that drive the rut. If you dropped an estrus doe in the middle of a woodlot, all hell would break loose, even if it was the middle of June in Minnesota, right?
Oh, I tell you, if I'm fortunate enough to be hunting in an area during the rut, and I see a buck chasing a doe that's clearly an estrus, hot doe, if I can anchor her, if I don't want the buck behind her, if I can anchor that doe inside of where I am, I'm going to sit there as long as I can, because I have seen it, and I know dozens of people that have, probably many on this webinar tonight, that have seen bucks try to breed a dead doe. If she's in estrus, they will literally try to breed her on the ground dead. But yeah, the scent of the estrus doe is in the air, and you can't do any better than to have a dead estrus doe laying within sight of your gun or bow stand, for sure. All right, let's talk a little bit about the variation. And this is really intriguing stuff, and you have to bear with me. There's a little bit of data here to go through. But so whenever I did the rut analysis for the whitetail rut map, part of the Pro Whitetail series, it just happened to work out really well, where I was able to break the rut, the 210 days of rut into three periods, 90-day periods. And so if you look on the map there, a date range tells you the beginning to the end of the early rut. So I basically broke all whitetail ruts into what I would consider early rutting deer herds, traditional rutting deer herds, and late rutting deer herds. And so the early rutting ones were July to September, and there were 119 counties there. So 3% of the whitetails range in 4 states. You can hunt what I would consider an early rut, something that's in the rut before the end of September. Traditional rut, that's October to December. That's peaks right through the middle of November. Just, that's the normal. And that's 79% of all areas in the country have that traditional rut. However, if you're after a late rutting deer herd, there's still 767 counties or parishes that have a late rut opportunity, and that's 18% of the whitetails range, and you have 7 states to pick from. All of this is available in the HuntStand app if you have access to the Pro Whitetail package. And again, not surprising, I mentioned it earlier, the whitetail rut is incredibly consistent in the northern half of the U.S. If you kind of draw I'll just say the Mason-Dixon line, Oklahoma to North Carolina, everything north of that, if you will, very consistent there. South of that line, we see a lot of variation. November by far is the peak of the rut month. 2,810 counties peak in November, peak of the rut. That's 2/3 of all counties in the country. And the earliest and latest rut start dates are in Florida. So if you live in Florida or have access to land in Florida, that's the only state where you can chase whitetails in the rut for 7 months of the year. You got to bounce around a little bit to do it. A lot of hunters say, where in the world is a herd, having the rut in July? And you'll be surprised it's extreme South Florida. So they're peaking in July and early August down there. It's not a lot of fun to hunt the rut when it's 105 degrees and 90% humidity and mosquitoes and gators and water moccasins, but they do it, and good for them. And if you want a late rut hunt, at Mississippi and Alabama, by far your best places to find one of those. Obviously, Louisiana and Texas also can be great places for late ruts, and Florida. So next slide. All right, here's some of those sort of just general sort of themes, misconceptions, things that we know about the rut. One thing that I hear often misstated, hunters will talk about finding a buck's rub line or a buck's scrape line, meaning singular. And research now has really dispelled that myth. In almost every case, a series of rubs, a series of scrapes, are actual community rubs and scrapes. Doesn't mean that there's not one buck that's using a lot of those often, but you put up trail cameras, in many cases, you're going to see, in most cases, you're going to see multiple deer, sometimes 10, 15 different bucks using a scrape, particularly those community scrapes that we talk about, those community rubs, the larger ones in those sort of, those great spots within the environment. Young bucks, and I'll say 1.5 and 2.5-year-olds here, only make about 15% as many scrapes as mature bucks, but they make about 50% of the number of rubs. So they're more likely to have a rub. A lot of hunters say, can you tell a buck size by its rub? If it's a small tree, no. If it's a tree that you can hang a climbing deer stand on, it's probably a mature buck and probably not a yearling buck. So to some extent, the answer is yes, you can. The average buck makes about 300 to 400 rubs a year, which blows a lot of hunters' mind. If you really go out and count the rubs on the landscape, we've had graduate students doing this for years. There's a lot more rubs out there than you probably think. And over 80% of the scrape activity occurs at night. And I mentioned earlier that scrape activity typically goes cold just before the peak of breeding. So if you're monitoring scrapes and all of a sudden they go cold on you, and it's about that transition period between the pre-rut and the rut, you know that peak breeding is about 7 days off, 7 to 10 days once those scrapes go cold. All right, next slide. I talked about a poorly defined rut. That's a very common thing that hunters ask me about is, hey, I'm just not seeing a defined rut on my property. In most cases, I can ask them, what is your buck age structure? What is your sex ratio? And in most cases, it's a bunch of young bucks and way too many does. And so you have this distorted, unbalanced deer herd situation. That's where you can see these kinds of things. And that's actually detrimental on many fronts. One, it's not much fun to hunt when you don't have a pronounced rut, but you're going to get this late born fawns and late born fawns. Research has shown that a much higher percentage of those late born fawns die to predation. So if you're worried about bears or coyotes or whatever the predator may be in your landscape, you're going to give more of them to more late born fawns are going to die than those born at the right time of year. And those late born fawns, research has shown that most of them will not produce the same size set of antlers at 1.5 years of age that they would have otherwise produced if born earlier. And most of them don't catch up fully to their counterparts ever. If they're stunted early, that most of them won't catch up. So that's important to note. Another pretty cool factor about the rut is that research has now shown that about one in 4 sets of twin fawns that hunters observe actually have 2 different fathers. So a set of twins, is not a set of twins, a set of twins. That the research has shown now that about 25% of twin fawns out there have different dads or different sires. And in fact, Auburn University has recorded at least one example of triple paternity where a set of triplets was produced by 3 different bucks. And so this is not hard to understand. If a buck's got a doe during the breeding season and he's breeding her and he gets displaced by perhaps a more dominant buck, that buck also can breed that doe. She's got 2 different ovaries that can be fertilized, and so it can happen that way. So that's just something else to kind of keep in mind as you go. Another big misnomer out there, and this one's been around a long time. It's actually what I did some of my graduate research on many years ago, and working with scent communication in whitetails. Many hunters have observed a behavior called the lip curl behavior or the Fleeman response. That's the buck in the picture with his head up and his nose and nostrils pinched, and he's vacuuming urine into a pit in the roof of his mouth. We've long said whitetails have a 6th sense. No, that is not their ability to pick you out of a deer stand perfectly motionless with the wind in your favor. Their 6th sense is a true 6th organ. That organ is that little diamond or oval shaped pit in the roof of their mouth. It's called the vomeronasal organ. And it's unique for the purpose of analyzing urine. And hunters had long thought that that's how a buck was determining a doe's estrus status. And it kind of made sense. Bucks do this when they encounter doe urine. It's almost exclusively a buck behavior. It's almost exclusively during the breeding season. So surely that has to be how a buck determines a doe's estrus status. But the research, again, sometimes gets in the way of a good story, and that's what happened here. And researchers at the University of Georgia, some of my research and my professor, Dr. Carl Miller, and his students did a number of studies over many, many years and just simply didn't prove that. And eventually were able to take the cross section of a deer's head and trace the pathway from that organ to the brain. And it didn't even access a portion of the brain capable of producing an immediate response like that doe's in heat, go find her. It actually triggered a very primitive part of the brain that essentially stimulated the sex drive in the animal. So in essence, when a buck's doing that during the deer season, he's not saying that, is this doe in heat or not? It's actually like taking a daily Viagra. It's keeping him sexually stimulated to keep looking. So it's kind of a primer mechanism more than a approximate determination of estrus. Question number 9 there, or statement 9, relates to the viewer's earlier question. No, bucks do not greatly expand, adult bucks do not greatly expand their home range during the rut, but they do use a larger percentage of their home range. So they spread out within their home range more and use a greater percentage. And we'll see some, I referenced the Mississippi State data earlier that I'm going to share just in moments. And some of their data support that firmly. So it's really cool that we're seeing that relationship. And lastly, this is also important, and it does help explain. We all have heard the stories or seen it ourselves where we're all running trail cams. We got every buck in the neighborhood pinned down. We know every buck around, and all of a sudden some giant buck just randomly shows up, and we either kill him or get a picture of him, and then he's gone again. And you think, well, maybe the neighbor shot him. In many cases, what explains this is this excursive behavior that we see in bucks, that they'll pack their bag and go a mile or more out of their home range, just a one-way ticket, hitchhike down the road, go 1 to 3 miles. They typically stay 24 to 36 hours, and then they return right back home. And they don't stay long. They don't change their home range stays static, but this is just a one-way movement out. And they often do it during the breeding season, but not always. Probably in search of does, maybe trailing a doe. We don't really know, but it does help explain this random occurrence sometimes of new bucks on the landscape that pop in and pop back out as fast as they're there. They're probably, if you don't harvest them, they're probably back home before you know it, and 2-3 miles away, and you won't have a chance at them again. But if you're lucky enough on that one day they come through your property, you may actually pick up a buck that technically lives 2 or 3 miles away, or further in some cases. All right.
Brian, before we move on to some of the research that you're going to present, some of the new research, we'll answer a couple of questions that came in the live Q&A and also in the registration. I'll kind of lump them together, and I'm sure it's something that you've answered hundreds of times throughout your career, but a lot of questions about how temperature and cold snaps or warm fronts can potentially affect rut timing. So if you could summarize that, that'd be great.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's a good point. So as I mentioned earlier, when I was putting together the deer movement predictive equation that took a great deal of time, I was able to look at all the research that I was aware of, at least many studies that looked at the relationship of every environmental variable, whether it's barometric pressure, humidity, temperature, wind speed, all those things. And the data, there's a lot of noise in the data. I'll start with that. But what we see consistently are the key drivers of deer movement during the breeding season are the phase of the breeding, the phase of the rut they're in. So that trumps weather. So, so regardless of warm or cold, if it's the peak of the rut, I'm going hunting because that will trump weather. However, weather certainly, changes in temperatures, particularly over a 24-hour change. We see, colder than average temperatures during the warm times of the year will definitely trigger some increased daytime activity. Changing barometer after a front passes through, and we see this rising barometer. A falling barometer is just the reverse. We see a crashing barometer. Generally, it's forecasting some pretty lousy conditions. So we see these changes. So certainly, if you see if you're at a time of the year when cooler than normal is good for deer movement, that cooler than normal when it's in mid-February is not good. Okay, when it's late season. So you got to obviously know what time of year we're talking about, but most of the whitetails range. A cold snap in late October, early November definitely will make a difference, and research supports that. Yes. All right, let's jump into this new stuff. This is really cool stuff, folks. It really geeks me out, and I'm so thankful that I've got friends within the deer research community that are willing to let HuntStand share their data. That's not common, and I don't take that privilege lightly. Because many of these data haven't been published in science forums yet. They're in the process of putting this research out there for publication now. So you're getting a preview of some of this that was presented for the first time at the Southeast Deer Study Group meeting earlier this year. So I thank all those authors there. So this, to my knowledge, is the largest study of wild adult bucks ever done with radio collars. So we're talking about 60 bucks that were at least 2.5 years of age, all the way up into, the very old age classes. So we're talking about 60, at least middle-aged, if not mature bucks, free range, Mississippi. This isn't a Texas study on a big ranch. So this is a really cool thing. And they did this from over a 3-year period, and they had radio telemetry collars on them that took 15-minute GPS fixes. So every 15 minutes of that buck's life, it got a fixed position on that animal, and they were able to record this. So this is, like I said, pretty hard to refute, solid stuff. So let's go to the next slide. So go ahead and put go ahead and click it to put all the, it's got some transitions. If you just hit the next 3, there you go. So they broke the hunting season lasts, as you can see, from October through the end of January. And note that this particular deer herd in Mississippi, the peak of the rut was at the end of December. So keep that in mind as we go through the next few slides, that their peak of the rut was a, Christmas time, if you will, sort of peak of the rut. Now, they went further for their analysis than I did when I spoke about the phases of the rut earlier. They broke the rut into 3 phases, or sort of 5 phases, actually. But we talked about the pre-rut, but they broke the peak rut into early rut, peak rut, late rut, post-rut. So they kind of have a little different subsets than I spoke of earlier. But just know that each of those brackets there represent 2 weeks of the season. So we're talking about 2-week increments throughout those months. So so when I show the data coming forward, you'll know what each of those represent 2 weeks during that period of the year. Next slide. So, and this is going to start to really make you think as a deer hunter real fast, because how many times have we all, thought we figured out where a buck was bedding that we were trying to harvest, and we had to avoid bumping him out of his bed. He beds in that thicket over there, or he beds in the swamp over here, or up on that hill there. And therefore, my access to my stand is going to, prevent him bumping him, so I can get between him and the does or the food source or whatever. And so this whole buck bedding sort of idea, and there's a lot of, I think, at least questionable data coming out of the Midwest in some areas at the private sector, talking about being able to put a buck, make a buck bed exactly where they want, and that sort of thing. I can't speak to that because this is out of Mississippi, but what I can speak to is that there's a pretty compelling case here. All right, so bed sites, I'm going to differentiate a bedding site for a buck and a bedding area. A bed site is where a buck was tracked at 4 or more consecutive points of time in less than a 20-yard area. So in other words, where he was, and these were 15-minute increments, right? So we're talking about for an hour, that buck stayed in the same exact spot for an hour. That was considered a bed site, and had to do so within a 20-yard radius. So pretty much didn't move. Next slide. They did go one more. So they did exclude food plots because it wouldn't be unheard of for a buck to stand in a food plot and feed for some period of time. So they did not, if those sites overlaid into a food source, a known food source like an ag field or a food plot, they were not considered a bedding area. So the green circles were considered bed sites where there was, again, 4 or more points within 20 yards within an hour. So that just gives you an idea what a bed site was for these animals. Next slide. Bedding areas were areas of 100 yards, more than 100 yards apart where those clusters existed. So that was a bedding area. So bedding area, for example, bedding area 1 on the slide, you can see has 2 different bed sites clusters, but it's still one bedding area. Okay. All right. So these are areas 100 or more yards apart. All right. Number of bed sites by bucks. That's good. Go ahead. All right. Go ahead and hit the slide. All right. So during the hunting season, that was the entire hunting season, the average buck had made 4 bed sites per day. Okay. So average day during the entire hunting season, the buck bedded 4 times throughout that 24-hour period. However, you can see that during the early rut and peak rut, they bedded less. Doesn't that make sense, right? Bucks are on the move more. They're probably bedding, 2 or 3 times a day instead of 4 times a day. They're not sleeping as much. So that's not surprising. But the fact that we now know that bucks bed on average about 4 times a day. So, every 8 hours, we're going to take a nap. That's not bad. Every 6 hours, rather. All right, next slide. All right, number of bedding areas. This is separate bedding areas. Go ahead and hit the graph. All right, so during the entire hunting season, the average buck had about 2 different bedding areas per day, but about 31 different bedding areas during the hunting season. So think about that. 31 different 100 yards separated by 100 yards or more. 31 was the average. The buck with the fewest had 8. The buck with the most had 87 bedding areas. Okay. And they had more bedding areas during the peak rut and the late rut. And again, it goes back to the one of the earlier questions. Does a buck, use a larger area, in this case, a larger area of its home range? So it has more bedding areas when it's using a larger portion of its home range. So we're seeing more bedding areas, but less frequent bed sites during the rut. All right, next slide. Fidelity is just how rigid they are to their areas, and this is pretty compelling stuff. So I'll just explain it. Don't try to worry about what it means. It can be a little confusing. The number of visits per buck to a bedding site. So if you look at the graph on the left, the bar on the left, it's about 45%. So 45% of all bedding areas were only used one time by bucks. So almost half the beds they make, they only use a single time. And if you add 2 to 5 visits back to those beds, if you add those two together, so 5 or less, you're talking about 70 or 80% of beds are 2 to 5 time uses only or less. Now there are some bed sites, as you can see, some of these bucks, the calibration jumps pretty quickly from 2 to 5 to 6 to 200 and 200 plus. So there are clearly a few bucks that will real frequently revisit their bed sites, but the vast majority of bucks use a bed 1 to 5 times, and that's it. Those are bedding areas. So they're not. This is not something they're using the same spots over and over. And I got a great slide here in a minute that'll help you visualize what that looks like. Next. Circuit time is the time between the time they come back to that same bedding site. So during the entire hunting season, again, looking at that 4 or 5 month period, the average time, circuit time, that's the time from using a bed one time, bedding area, and then circling back to that same bedding area, was 6 days. So about once a week, it took them to get back to that, using that same bedding area. And we actually saw a little bit more activity during early rut in terms of that was during a 2-week period. Those data support a 2-week period. So we see a little more, regular use of those bed sites in the early rut and the peak rut. But pretty interesting stuff that, some of these bucks are only circling back. Many of these bucks are only circling back to those same bedding areas almost on a weekly basis. So they have a big circuit, right? So they're using a big part of their home range, and they're working a big area, and they're bedding along the way. And to get back around, in many cases, we're talking about, several days or more before they circle back to that location. Next. So this, we're going to play you, hang on just a minute before you play the graph. Let me explain this. This is a 2-week actual pictorial of one buck's movements and its bedding sites and areas. So you'll see both bedding sites and bedding areas. It was a 3.5-year-old buck during just that last phase of the early rut. So really peak movement time for a buck. And go ahead and hit that. This is a 2-week pictorial of one buck's bedding sites and bedding locations.
You're making me feel like my hope for patterning the buck I'm after in Wisconsin is about out the window.
All right. Go ahead and go to the next slide, the next graphic. All right. And hit it one more time. And again. All right. So this buck in 2 weeks, one 3-year-old buck, 2 weeks, had 41 different bed locations and sites, actual sites, and 17 bedding areas separated by 100 yards or more. If you'll note, this is a 1 mile scale if you look across the bottom. And so it's about And if you turn the 1 mile scale up on its axis, on the vertical axis, it's about a mile square. What we're looking at on the screen is about a mile square. So it's about 600 and let's call it 650 acres for easy math here, 640. So if you're hunting a buck that's got and that's about a normal home range size for a buck, it's about a square mile. So this is very characteristic of a buck. Certainly there was a concentrated area. That circle shows a concentrated area where he was more likely to bed. But if you were going to try to kill this buck by setting up on his bedding area, you tell me where you're going to set up, how you going to do it. And this is with radio collars knowing where he is. And of course we don't have that kind of data. So it really makes you wonder just how our theories of buck beds really go. Now, I'll talk about this in a minute because this is a very densely forested area of the Southeast. It is not the Midwest. So this idea of 1 or 2 or 3 buck beds is where this buck's always going to go bed and seek its refuge is absolutely a myth. You have to use the plural form of buck bedding areas to be correct. Go ahead, go to the next slide. It's a good time to lead into this. This was a Mississippi study site. It was a large private property there. It was heavily forested, had heavy dense cover. Would this apply, next slide, would this apply to, agricultural Midwest where habitat is very limited? I'm sure you would see some vast differences. So, obviously if you live in the agricultural Midwest where, you've just got fingers of woods here and there, I would expect a higher percentage of buck beds to be in those areas that you have. Because your bedding areas are not uniformly distributed. But I would also challenge you to create more buck bedding areas because I think the research would support that you can actually house more bucks if you've got more buck bedding areas. So focus on thick understory vegetation, heavy cover, heavier the better. I know a lot of hinge cutting and various techniques are used in parts of the upper Midwest and Northeast. Certainly that's a good idea, but I would be looking at more habitat level, old field growth, early successional habitat, old field management, prescribed fire, anything I could do to get very dense understory because that's going to create more buck bedding opportunities on that property. And lastly, we're going to talk about some cool research. Some of this same study, same researchers, again, Mississippi State University. They looked at how bucks use food plots during the hunting season. And this was pretty cool stuff. And most all of us hunt food plots, most all of us hunt bucks. So it's pretty interesting stuff. Next slide. So food plot visitation. This was visitation, daily visits during the hunting season by bucks broken down by the different phases of the breeding season. And as you see here, it's kind of a general pattern of increasing visitation. So basically bucks, as the season progressed, again, knowing that their peak of the rut was that green, sort of blue-green section, December to January. If you kind of look through there, activity was very high in terms of visitation, but it continued to increase. So late season, again, deer hungry, late season, they're on those food plots. So basically we just saw an increasing pattern of visitation. But they separated visitation from time spent. So visitation just means they showed up there. Doesn't mean they spent much time. So next slide talks about that. So visitation time is the amount of time they spent on those food plots. And you see a pretty much a decreasing, a reverse or inverse pattern here. So bucks may have been visiting food plots more during the breeding season, but they're spending less time. So they're swinging by, scent checking for does, grabbing a mouthful and heading on down the road. So with one exception, late season. So what we see here is that if you look after the rut, if you look at the pink and red circles on the far right of the graph, we actually see that not only is visitation highest during the late season, but time spent is also the highest. So this just speaks to the importance of hunting. If you have the ability to hunt late season where you are, hunt those food sources because those bucks are coming. They have to. They're depleted. They're hungry, and they're going to be vulnerable late season. So it's certainly worth the effort to hunt as late in the season as you can and hold out for one of those mature bucks that's trying to regain that lost body condition. Next slide. So what size were these food plots and what was the most commonly visited? So on their study site, the most common size of a food plot was 1 acre. Pretty standard. A lot of hunters have smaller micro plots. Some have bigger, but this was pretty standard food plot acreage size. A lot of small one. Everything from about half acre to 3 acres was most of the size of the food plots, and that's pretty common. Next slide. But what I thought was very interesting here, though, and it kind of does make sense, the most common food plot size visited by bucks was around 4 acres. So even though far more plots were 1 acre in size than any other size, the most visited by a pretty significant amount was those around 4 acres. And and you ask yourself, all right, so you got more bucks visiting, and these larger, I'd say fairly large, 4 acres is a good sized food plot. More activity. Why? Well, I think larger food plots attract more does, more deer in general, but also they're less likely to be browsed out, particularly mid and late season if you got a high deer density. So these bucks that are stopping, during the breeding season looking for does have a better chance of meeting their energy demands with fewer bites on a more productive, larger food plot. So if you have a chance, then you can obviously try to move those food plots a little larger. And I get it, a 4 acre food plot on many parts of the country is a giant food plot. But again, just showing you what the data support, the larger appears to be better. So I would push your food plot acreage as big as you can. It seems to be attracting more bucks, and probably just, again, more deer in general. Next. And that's pretty much going to wrap up the talk. There's a whole lot more to their study that I'd love to share with you about how deer, how close they bed to food plots at night and how they use the wind. There's a lot of cool stuff out there, but we'll save that for next round. We've gone a pretty good while here tonight, and I appreciate the attention. And I think we're going to either give away some prizes or answer some questions or both.
That's right. We are going to give away some prizes. So for those of you stuck around, hopefully it's worthwhile for the 3 of you who I'm about to randomly draw right now. All right, so just give me a sec. This is proof that it is a random drawing from the existing or remaining participants. All right. As you guys can see, sweet prize package here. We've got just give me one sec. All right. So we got the Flex Tone Battle Bag Plus. That's like a rattling bag if you want to do any calling, rattling style. We got the Flex Tone Extractor Grunt Tube for grunting, and then you can see it's got the extra channel on there if you want to do snort wheezes. Also got the Flex Tone Battle Bones, another option for rattling. If you kill something, hopefully you do, got the Cold Steel Fixed Blade Hunting Kit. I just used that for the first time about 4 days ago when I was in Wyoming pronghorn hunting. So it wasn't whitetails, but I can promise you it works equally well on whitetails. And then Stealth Cam's coming in with the Revolver 360-degree cellular trail camera. As you can see on that camera, if you're not familiar with it, it has 6 different PIR detection zones surrounding the camera and a rotating lens on the inside. So it'll actually give you 360-degree coverage no matter where that camera is triggered, so deer can't slip by. We've seen some pretty cool stuff already from that camera where we've seen mature bucks trying to sneak around the camera to get around it, but they don't realize that they're getting picked up because it's 360. And then we've got the flashback from Stealth Cam. It's a white flash camera. A lot of skepticism from people we've seen about whether a white flash scares deer. And I can tell you that working closely with Stealth Cam, the reason we brought back a white flash camera is because so many hardcore deer hunters wanted them. The demand was really high. And so hardcore deer hunters had no worries about the white flash scaring deer. I think Brian would agree that every deer has an individual personality. Different things might affect different deer different ways. So some bucks might have a complete aversion to cameras or the scent that's associated with them from visiting them or etc. A lot of deer don't care. I'm running several flashbacks myself. The benefit of that white flash is really unbelievable nighttime images to get that clarity and be able to kind of figure out what kind of deer you're working with. Um, the nighttime clarity is insane. The daytime is great too, but I have not seen any deer noticeably spooked from it myself, nor has anybody on our team. So love that flashback. And then we've got the Stealth Cam Fusion Max 2-pack, just an all-around great camera, high quality photos, videos with audio, and these are all cell cams. So you're not going to have to visit your cameras too often if you use the right battery supplies. And then also for when you're on the hunt or after, the Scentaway Max Ultimate Hunting Kit. I got a couple of those myself. They're sweet. I really like the field wipes that are in there for just kind of refreshing yourself before you go out to the stand, or even sometimes if you're out there, if you sweated your way in, it's nice to wipe down. And of course, if you kill something, it's nice to be able to wipe that blood off your hands in the end. And then last but not least, if you do want to try any type of scent, got the Buck Bomb Rut Kit. Mock scrapes, a lot of questions about mock scrapes and licking branches, and we'll get to some of that here during the Q&A next. But for those of you who stuck around, I guess I'll announce the 3 winners. Each of you are going to get this whole package. So we got Bob Norton, Chris Newton, and Leonard, I believe it's Ruffer, Ruffer. We will be contacting you via email. We got your address from the registration. So be patient with us. It might take a day or two, but we're going to get you set up and get your shipping info to make sure you guys get these prize packages, and hopefully you can still use them during deer season. If you want to stick around, there are a lot of you still here, actually over 300. So that's pretty cool. We've been going for over an hour now, and we're going to go into the Q&A. So I'm just going to do some rapid fire here with Brian. A lot of questions that were submitted live chat and during registration. A lot of kind of similar questions. So one thing I like to do is put them together, kind of aggregate them so we can help answer a lot with a little bit of time. Popular one for you, Brian. A lot of people want calling advice, especially as it relates to different stages of the rut. So if you could break it down, maybe like pre-rut and peak rut at least, what do you recommend for calling?
Yeah, so I'd probably be pretty similar to others who call. First thing I would say is we have tested deer hearing capacity, and the grunt the grunt that a buck makes and or your call makes. We've even tested the calls. They make the buck the grunt in that same range of hearing. Actually, is in the peak of the whitetail's hearing range, and those low guttural grunts are we think for a purpose. Because if you look at what travels the furthest in the environment, we use foghorns and train horns, these big, loud, low tonal sounds. They travel farther in the environment than pitchy, high-pitched sounds. So basically what I'm getting at is a grunt goes further in the environment than you think it does. However, I've always said, you stay on that grunt call until you get that deer's attention. If you're calling to a specific buck, if you can see them. Sometimes they're distracted or whatever, or can't hear you, or walking through leaves. Once you get their attention, you can back off on the volume. But from a seasonality standpoint, if I'm going to call it all during early archery season before any of the traditional buck vocalizations will work, sometimes I'll use a fawn in distress call if I'm bow hunting for antlerless deer. Sometimes early archery season you can get does to respond to fawn in distress calls. Then move into just some light grunting. As the season gets closer and closer, I'll get more aggressive with my grunts, try to sound not just bat, but try to sound like a buck walking and following something. So just almost have a cadence to it, like a buck is actually walking. I mentioned the grunt, snort, wheezes earlier. I've had great success with grunt, snort, wheeze. I do it just with my mouth, my own voice. They make calls for it. But it's the first time you do it, if you never heard it, in a buck make it, the first time you do it, you'll feel like an idiot. You'll feel like an absolute idiot for making this sound, because it's the most undeer sounding call that you'll ever make. And quick side note, I was hunting with a young Australian female bow hunter a couple of years ago in Kentucky, and she wanted me to sit with her and kind of help her work out the whitetail. She'd never hunted whitetails with her bow, and we had this giant 7.5-year-old buck come trolling up through there, and he was off the plot, and I'd forgotten my grunt calls that morning like a dummy. and she had never even heard a buck grunt, let alone a grunt, snort, wheeze. And anyway, I told her he was about to leave the field out of bow range, and I said, "Hang on a minute, I got to try this." So I just leaned out of the little ground blind and grunt, snort, wheeze with my voice. And I looked back at her, and she had the most perplexed look on her face, like, "What in the world are you doing?" Took me one more grunt, snort, wheeze, and I had that 7-year-old buck in bow range for her. She got 2 shots at it. She didn't kill him, but we brought him in on a string, and he was ticked off. You can't call a buck a worse name. You've really assaulted not only them but their mother by grunt, snort, wheezing at them. So definitely get into that as you can, and don't be afraid. I think the main thing with calling, I would say, particularly if you're hunting and you maybe hadn't been calling much that morning, or maybe not at all, and you have to get down at 9 o'clock in the morning or 10 o'clock in the morning, or you're still hunting through the woods and you're getting ready to turn and go a different direction. Why not call? At that point, why not call? You got nothing to lose. So go ahead and call and sit there, and you'll be surprised. Most times it's not going to work. Okay. It's like calling predators or throwing a bass lure out there. Most times you're not going to be successful doing it, but when it happens, it's a lot of fun and it'll make you a believer. So I would say that's my quick advice. Call more often than you think, call louder than you think until you get their attention. If you are calling to a specific animal, then back off. And once they start coming, it's just like turkey hunting. If you've got one coming your way, shut up. Don't blow it at that point. Call just enough to get their attention and get them interested. They know where your tree is pretty quick. And I would just back off as soon as you get there, get them coming.
I think another important thing to add on, you mentioned whether you're calling to a deer that you can see, or the opposite would just be blind calling. I think, it's not bad to try blind calling, of course, but if you're going to do so, you want to make sure that you're set up pretty bulletproof, or as bulletproof as you can get when it comes to wind direction. When there's a deer you can see, then you know how it's operating, you know where it's working, you know what direction it's going, you can keep eyes on it. But if you're blind calling, a lot of times you might blind call and have a deer circle downwind of you, and you'll never even know, because they'll vanish and you'll never even know it was in.
That's a great point, and the same is true with rattling and calling together or even separately. But a good friend of mine, Dr. Mickey Hellickson from South Texas, did some research years ago on rattling, and found that they were able to rattle in areas that had high towers around them. So they had an observer in the sky, if you will. And the guy on the ground rattling only saw 40% of the total bucks that responded. So 60% of the bucks that responded to his antlers, he never knew were there, and an observer saw them. And the other thing they found, which was interesting, is they tried 4 different sequences of rattling. They had a short, loud, a short, quiet, a long, loud, and a long, quiet sequence. So they had tried 4 different combinations, and by far the short, loud, and long, loud rattling sequences attracted significantly more bucks than either of the 2 quieter ones. And it's because the volume carries further, you have more deer interact with the sound. So my experience and what the research shows is that we typically call and rattle too softly. It's not bad to start soft in case you have a deer close to you. There's nothing wrong with starting soft, but as if it's windy at all, you're going to hear me banging some antlers together. I'm going to carry through that wind because I want somebody to hear me.
Yeah, if you're using real antlers, burn them out. You'll smell the bone. Actually, it smells like it's burning from the friction. You're hitting it so hard. So don't, like he said, don't be shy. Related question: does rattling scare does? I'll have you answer that, but I will say it sure will if they see you. That's another thing with rattling is you got to be careful, especially even if you're in a tree stand. Doesn't hurt to kind of rattle behind your back, or just kind of keep it a little bit more concealed, because you don't know if there's a deer in sight that might see you, and they're going to key in on that, where that sound came from. And if they are within sight, it's a lot easier for them to spot you if they can see you beating antlers or a rattle bag together. And that actually happened to me 2 weeks ago. I threw out some rattling because the bucks were starting to get aggressive around here. And sure enough, I didn't realize there were some does out in the corn, and they got the hell out of there. But as a generality, Brian, a few people asked, does rattling adversely affect or scare does?
I've had very few experiences where I can say the rattling made the does uneasy, and I would say I've had a few examples where very young bucks also didn't respond favorably to antlers. I've had the same reaction occasionally to decoys, where does or bucks see a decoy and just aren't comfortable with it for whatever reason. But it's like anything else. Yeah, you're going to have a few negative interactions, but in my experience, with calling and with decoying, the positive interactions outweigh the negative, in my experience. And I'm certainly not aware of any general trend where rattling is going to cause does to. I mean, if you're in an area that's got mature bucks that spar and occasionally even throw down and fight, it won't be a sound they don't know what it is, and they may move out of the way if they're not in the mood. But I don't think it's going to make them head for the hills in most cases.
Speaking of does, a lot of questions that I'll try to boil down here, related to buck to doe ratios, et cetera. But let me ask it this way. A lot of people were wondering, is it better to try to strive from a hunting perspective, a hunting quality perspective? Is it better to strive for an even buck to doe ratio, or are you better off stocking does if you can on your property so that you have more does for bucks to work with?
Yeah, so there is a belief that, if I've got 5 does, for every buck on my property, then not only am I going to keep my bucks happy, but I'm going to attract more bucks from neighbors. Uh, the research really doesn't support that, frankly. And in fact, what I would rather see is as a more balanced. I'm not talking about, you having to have a 1-to-1 adult sex ratio. You don't have to be that tight, but I want it pretty tight because, otherwise, what few bucks are on the landscape are going to be tied down with a doe all the time because they don't have to work for it. If you got a fairly even sex ratio, a lot of bucks are going to be without a girlfriend at times during the breeding season. A lot more of them are going to be on their feet looking. So the visibility of those mature bucks is going to be greater. Now, what a lot of people don't understand about sex ratios, and first of all, there's 2 different sex ratios that are important here. One is what biologists call the adult sex ratio. That is your 1.5-year-old does and bucks, that ratio of those 2 together. It excludes your fawns, in other words. And then the other is called your total sex ratio. That includes your fawns. And what people don't realize is that literally you can end the season, post-hunting season, with 10 does for every 1 buck. Okay, 10-to-1 ratio at the end of the season. It can be that bad in some areas, right? Buck over harvest. Did you know that with just minimal reproduction, half of which are going to be buck fawns, that starting the next hunting season, your sex ratio is going to be 3-to-1 or better right out of the gate? Now, most of those are young males. I'm not saying that's an adult sex ratio, but what I'm getting at here is that highly distorted sex ratios, Mother Nature tries to fix those very quickly if you let her. Just the sheer number of buck fawns that get recruited back into the herd each year, if you just back off even a little bit, you can have a sex ratio better than 3-to-1 fairly quickly. Now, I have seen situations that have a disproportionate sex ratios in favor of bucks. Those are rare, but there are places that literally have shot enough does over a long enough period of time, and they've realized that their property can only handle 100 deer on it for ease of math's sake. And they'd rather have 70 bucks and 30 does, just enough does to replace the bucks they're harvesting. That's not realistic for 90% of hunters. I get that, but I'm just saying they do exist. But yeah, I think in most cases, a sex ratio of about 2 adult does for every adult buck is plenty acceptable throughout most of the whitetails range. And that's what I would be striving for in most areas.
Brian, I hate to do this to you, but I knew someone was going to ask. Now, Randy Doherty is really hoping that you'll do a grunt snort wheeze for us, but you might have to do it a little bit quieter because Zoom has a volume control where it'll cut out loud noises. So
yeah, I think I tried it last year and it cut me out because to get it right, but I can try it. It's hard to do softly though, so I have to kind of. But it starts with just a basic grunt, and then it's followed by it's kind of a. Well, I just have to do it. It's hard to even explain, but it's a long exhale at the end, so it's a grunt, and really get on that tail. And like I said, you do that to a buck, and he knows you just called him a pretty bad name, and if he's at all aggressive, he will come. So yeah, but there's probably some good videos on YouTube of either bucks making it. I'm sure there are, or hunters replicating it that can do it louder. I couldn't do it at full volume here because of the it cuts you out. Thinks you're yelling at the screen or something, I guess.
yeah, I've let's see here, like 27 years or something I've been deer hunting now, and I still have not heard a grunt snort wheeze in person. ever. In fact, I told you this, but it was, I think, 2 seasons ago, maybe 3 seasons ago, when I heard quote unquote buck roar for the first time, and I heard it 2 times, and that was that was pretty cool. It was spine tingling, but and I've actually heard it since then, but I have not heard a
Yeah,
grunt.
the grunt snort wheeze is the aggressive, really ticked off vocalization. The growl or roar is the most frustrated when they are truly just at their wits end, frustrated, uh, perhaps mixed with some anger and aggression, but slightly different context. One is straight up aggression and kind of a bluff call. That grunt snort wheeze is really, again, you better back off or we're fighting. It's my last nerve. Whereas the you're walking along just frustrated. Everything in your life's gone wrong that day. We've all had those days when you just want to just yell at the world. That's kind of what the buck roar and growl does, is just total frustration in most cases. But yeah, I've had the good fortune of hearing both of those. And in fact, my good friends and mentors, Dr. Larry March and Dr. Carl Miller, were the first ones to ever to document those vocalizations in whitetails officially and record the whole vocabulary, if you will, of the whitetail. And I think there are 12 or 14 known vocalizations or calls that a whitetail can make. So they're more vocal than just a few grunt snorts and balls. But there's all kinds of other little mew calls that fawns can make, and contact calls, and some other little subtle ones.
Well, guys, before we bow out here, I just want to say a lot of the other questions, I mean, a lot of them revolved around rut timing and if it can vary and this and that. All I'm going to say is, and this is a direct sale right here, get HuntStand Pro Whitetail. Use the rut map. It is undisputably accurate. And then you pair that with the whitetail activity forecast, and you are going to know unequivocally the best times to be in the woods. And, I know a lot of us just don't have as much time as we would like. So if you only get, you know, one day next week to go or the week after, or you only got so much time and you can choose when to go, use those tools. I've been using them since we put them out. And like I've told Brian before, once he developed that algorithm, I was like, all right, I'm going to be testing this thing and I'm going to let you know when it's wrong. And I've tried to prove it wrong so many different times for the whitetail activity forecast, and I can't. I mean, it takes a rare event. Brian has a pretty cool story about that. I'll let him share before we bail out of here. About a buddy he ran into, couldn't quite figure out why deer were doing what they're doing one day. But I've tried beating the whitetail activity forecast many times. It hasn't worked yet. It doesn't mean you shouldn't hunt, but you might have to hunt closer to a bedding area. You might have to get more aggressive to be in the game. But when they're not moving, they're not moving. And the whitetail activity forecast is going to tell you when they are the most likely to be moving. So it's the real deal. So get HuntStand Pro Whitetail. You'll have access to that. I'll let Brian share that story, and we'll end with that story. But the last thing I'll say is thanks everybody once again for attending. Thanks for being loyal to HuntStand. Check us out at huntstand.com. Look at our field notes section on our website. Tons of great content on there. A bunch of rut related content that we already have archived, and more new stuff that'll be coming out yet this year. Check out the HuntStand podcast. You'll find us on all the social media platforms. We really appreciate you guys, and it's a two-way street. So please feel free to engage, communicate with us, ask questions, and all that. We really appreciate you. And I'll leave it to Brian for one last little story about why the whitetail activity forecast is so gnarly.
It's good. And I just saw a late question comes in that said we didn't mention anything about doe bleats. I actually did mention them very briefly early on. That is a great strategy to use, particularly during that waning rut and post-rut phase. That's when I really like to use that doe bleat, because they're looking for that last doe or two of the year. So doe bleats can be quite effective. So great question there. Yeah, the whitetail activity index, for those of you using it, I want to clarify something that has confused some people. When you look at the forward-looking forecast, it gives you a percentage score for each day. And obviously it's going to tell you which one has the highest percentage. That means nothing about if it gives you an 82%, that doesn't mean you have an 82% chance of seeing a deer. I can't predict that. Well, all I can say is in the model, 82% of the variables are in your favor for peak deer movement. So it's based on a 100% sort of scale. It would take the absolute perfect conditions, peak of the rut, bluebird sky, rising barometer, cold front. I mean, you'd have to have everything going perfectly to get close to 100% score. but anything, kind of like back in grade school, 70% or better is a passing grade, go hunt. 80% is pretty darn good. Anything above 90, you better get your butt out of school and in the deer woods because it's time to hunt. So that's a percentage of the model variables that support deer movement in your area for your deer herd at its time of the breeding season. So it is very site specific. It will change as weather forecasts change because it's got weather variables built into it. But one quick story that Josh wanted me to point out is I was, the first year I built the thing, we were testing it, and I was just happened to be over at a local buddy of mine that does all my bow work on my bow, and I needed a peep sight retied, and he's an older guy, a little older than I am, and doesn't use any technology, and but he lives on his own farm, hunts every day, morning and evening during bow season. Real avid bow hunter, real good one. And so I was chatting with him during lunch. We was tying my bow peep in and my peep sight, and I asked him how's hunting's going. Man, I've been seeing deer morning and evening every day. Been moving real good. And he said, but not today. Said, today I went and man, deer weren't this morning. Nothing moved. And I have no reason why. And this is in September in the South. It's hot. And I'm thinking, well, it's just kind of hot. And I just happened to remember looking at my activity index forecast. And for the first time, it had shifted from an evening pattern to a 10 or 11 a.m. pattern. And I thought to myself, I was even wondering if there's a bug in my program because it was telling me to hunt at 10 o'clock in the morning in September when it's going to be 80 degrees. And, but I'd remembered that it had predicted that. So when he said, but whenever I was out running errands about 11, he said, deer were everywhere. And I remembered that the forecast said 10 o'clock was the peak movement time that morning. So I pulled up my phone and said, hey, have a look at this. If you'd have followed my advice, you'd been hunting this morning. How'd you do that? And I said, to be honest, I don't even know because there's more data in that formula than I can crunch myself, right? I mean, that's the beauty of plugging in all the data from all these different pieces is it calculates things that I can't even myself analyze all those variables, even as a biologist with some understanding. And I had another situation when we were beta testing it. It was in July, a couple of years ago before we launched it. And I want to look at a rutting deer herd. The only rutting deer herd was in Florida. So I expected very high scores because it's a rutting deer herd. And it was, 87%, 91%. And all of a sudden it dropped down to like 60% one day in the peak of the rut. And I thought, oh no, there's definitely a bug in the system until I looked at the closer detail. A hurricane was coming through and it has a definite penalty for high winds and some other things. And so it picked up that very accurately too. So most of the other models out there, frankly, I don't want to talk bad about anybody's model, but most of them are based on a limited number of variables for one geographic location. They don't have the underlying base layer of the rut map and all the breeding, 5,500 different breeding sets of data underneath them. So there's no way they can be consistently accurate in all landscapes because they just don't have the same foundational pieces. I mean, that's just a fact of biology. It's not anything on their side. But anyway, I'll end with that. Thank you again for joining us this evening. I hope you learned something. That's the thing we try to do more than anything is just if you got one or two good tidbits, it was hopefully worth your time. And we appreciate your customer appreciation of HuntStand and being part of our team. And we're going to keep working very hard to keep bringing new things. And for those of you, one little teaser tidbit, for those of you that like to hunt Western species, we're soon to announce the same feature set, both rut dates, geographic maps, and movement forecasts for elk, mule deer, and blacktail deer. I've just about finished that whole work up for the last couple of years working on that with another biologist out west. And so if you hunt those other species, hang in there. You're going to have the same tools for them very soon.
And that's what you get for coming to these hunt classes because you are the first people to know that outside of our core circle. So
I may not have should have told them, but I couldn't help it. Had to let the cat out of the bag on that one.
It's all good. If they stuck around this long and they didn't even win anything, then they definitely deserve to know that. So, all right. Thanks, Brian. Thanks to everybody else. We will be following up with an email. You'll be able to see this recording if you want to review it or share it with anybody. Thanks again. We'll see you on the next one.